Just a quick note. Thank you very much to Physiological Society for the opportunity to speak here, and also thanks, Mike, for your mentorship and your friendship over so many years. And all that my colleagues and friends who work sort of on this area with me there. And there's two photos of Mike there, and one's Mike in his extreme environment, and the other one's him making everyone else's environment extreme, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So what I'm doing is I'm just setting the scene, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. Dr. Ollie Gibson's going to do that. And it's providing a context and some relevance and maybe some limitations and, as I say, some context. I want to put exercise in that context in particular. And if we get time, we'll go through some other stresses, some combined stressor effects as well. Now, this week, we've been dealing mostly with this end of the spectrum. So if we think of the environments that we live in, we've pretty much been here. Some people have been toying around between these two as the week goes on. We've had this one where we've had a lack of force, especially gravity. We've had thermal environment at both ends, but we haven't really dealt with some others, and these aren't by all means most of them. Like, what are some others? What are some other stresses that we need to be exposed to? Too much or too little can either kill us or at least affect our quality of life. What would you say is two or three others? Sleep? Yep, I'm not sure if it fits in that model or not. Sorry, just in terms of trying to clarify the question, what's a stressor? It might be an energy, a form of energy. It might be a particle. It might be molecules, a compound, maybe light, maybe pollutants, maybe radiation, ionizing radiation maybe. So that's not all of them, but they're some of the ones that I think are most important, that we need to be exposed to some level, but we can't be exposed to too much. And this gets very much at the point Mike was trying to make before, that physiology needs change. And it needs change in all these respects, and we can detect them and adapt to them and so forth and learn from them. So I'll ask you another question. I'll answer it a bit later, but hopefully you might do it for me. And that's, what do you think is the most extreme environment for humanity? And I guess we asked the same question a number of years ago, and we had a symposium on it, and it was similar to this. And that was, we wrote an editorial called Moving in Extreme Environments, What's Extreme and Who Decides? Any environment contains multiple stresses typically. It's seldom that you get any environment that has a singular stressor. So even in a cold environment might have a lack of oxygen or excess oxygen, and James Clark talked to us about that before. And John Castellani talked to us on Monday about cold and the combination of cold and oxygen, and we've got Alex Lloyd here who's done work on that from a peripheral perspective and how they have additive effects. And we can have thermal environments with a lack of water or a lack of accessible water. And we have thermal environments here that have plenty of water. Do you want to hit the... So there's plenty of water there. I mean, you only need to open your mouth and you've got as much as you want. But that particular water, you probably don't want that much of it. So it's the quality of the water, the potability, the acceptability of the water as well. So we have a lot of these composite environments, and yet we hardly study them in that way. And Mike talked about this morning. He talked about the fact that we're only those 23 studies that had looked either combined stresses acutely or combining them or crossing them adaptively. And since then, there's been somewhat just a massive increase. So for example, in 2017, there were 2 concurrent case series topics being accepted by Frontiers on one side and the American Physiological Society on the other. So there's a lot of research around this now. And that sort of gets to our definition, and Ollie's going to carry on with this, but Cross-adaptation is where we use one stressor to confer some adaptation that enhances our tolerance or reduces our strain in another one. And the most abundantly tested is some thermal environment against a hypoxic environment. And we can also take cold against a high nutrition, or to protect us against a high nutritional environment by trying to change our white fat into metabolically active fat. When we adapt to any environmental stressor, we tend to get systemic adaptations or we get cellular adaptations. And those cellular adaptations sometimes are stress protective proteins that confer protection against a number of stresses. So they're quite ubiquitous in their utility. So there's two, and that would be called cross-tolerance. So that's cellular effects that will mediate and protect against multiple stressors. If it's systemic, then and it will confer protection against another stress, we tend to call that cross-adaptation. So then we can take two stresses that confer different but complementary stresses, such as potentially heat and hypoxia, and try and protect ourselves against one of those, or another stressor, such as exercise, or a combination, such as exercise and hypoxia. And we can also take two, like heat and orthostasis, and run them through and then potentiate any particular set of systemic outcomes to protect ourselves against heat or hypoxia or exercise in the heat or whatever. So there's lots of possibilities for mixing and matching, and this is done on physiological rationale. So you have a need, and the need may be you're an athlete. So you want to enhance your fitness, not necessarily in a harsh environment, just your fitness. You may be being deployed to a situation where you're going into a novel stressor. And this thing's causing a bit of interest at the moment, Dorian. And you may be either trying to flee from that, tolerate that, or clean up after that. So that might be done on a fairly short time frame, in which case you might be looking at more the thermotolerance effect and any rapidly obtained adaptations from any given stressor that will confer that in the appropriate time frame. Now, these stressors, we can impose them globally, we can do them systemically, and we can do them localized. And there may or may not be a clean stressor. We can also, for heat, for example, do it globally, systemically, or locally. And we've had examples of that this week. There's a beautiful example by Nuno Steves on Monday, I think it was, just using selective location of stressors to look at normal physiological mechanisms. And often that's done bilaterally. So you'll treat one limb differently than another to look at the effect of the environmental stressor. We've had a lot of environments, a lot of cases, for example, this week on this one as well, where we use the environmental extreme to try and simulate what happens in pathological practice in terms of pathology without having the pathology. And then we have other contexts that are also clinic as well. We can prehabilitate somebody. In other words, we can prime them to withstand a forthcoming stressor, and that might be a surgery. In fact, it typically would be a surgery. And then there's a rehabilitation coming after that. So if we can build their capability before they hit the surgery, then we prevent the atrophy so badly during the rehab. And there's been a lot of animal research in that area, and it's particularly focused, for example, on heat. And there's a lot of time courses of this, so we can use anesthetics acutely, we can use ischemia, we can even use the ischemia after the ischemia started. We can apply ischemia somewhere else, and then the humoral mediators will help lessen the ischemia reperfusion damage in the primary ischemic location. So there's a lot of mixing and matching even with an acute time frame like that. And then as we get out into longer time frames, we can apply heat acutely in one bout. We can do it multiple times. We can do the same with exercise for people who are able to. So there's a lot of possibilities there. Heat really is quite a ubiquitous stressor in the sense that there's evidence for it having a lot of functional capacities. It affects multiple physiological systems, particularly every element of the cardiovascular system, lots of elements within muscle, both from stress protective, cytoprotective, mitochondrial, a lot of metabolic effects within muscle, glucoregulation, blood pressure regulation at systemic levels, central nervous system effects. So yeah, heat's a pretty useful singular stressor. So we've been looking at that, for example, in a number of respects, and this was a study that we put out recently, where we were looking to see, and this is another really important point, I think, that we think of extreme environments, but the less physical capability you have and the more your structures and function degrade, those extreme environments are within you, not outside you. So you can be living in a benign environment for somebody else, and from your tissues perspectives, they're in an extreme environment. It doesn't so much matter whether that's external or internally imposed. So for them, just trying to walk is an extreme environment. But for somebody else, they might be at 7,500 meters. And heat for these people who have very limited exercise capacity, for example, in peripheral arterial disease, is a very useful stressor. So we looked at that and we used spa bathing, and one of the real benefits of spa bathing is it doesn't matter how much you adapt. If your core temperature increases the same every day, because you can adapt your thermolytic processes, but it doesn't help you cool down. And therefore it provides a good cardiovascular stress on a daily basis. And another important point about exercise and any other form of conditioning like this is that there's two windows of advantage, and one's the acute recovery period and the other one's the underlying phenotype that you're slowly changing. And we might think that exercise or a heat therapy has very little effect on as an antihypertensive agent. We're kind of forgetting about the fact that you're always recovering from a singular bout, so we can add that on as well. So there's the acute effect and there's the chronic effect, and there's small differences. There's not very much difference between. If we gave these participants, these patients, either supervised exercise training or 5-day-a-week, half-hour spa bathing, and we increased their functional capacities in both respects. But we got less effect than what, for example, the Liverpool group did, Tom Bailey, first author on this paper, where they exposed young female adults to either 3-day-a-week water conditioning or exercise conditioning, improved aerobic power in both groups and improved FMD, and certainly Chris Minson's group, who do pretty significant volumes of spa bathing, so 90-odd minutes in the spa, and they get significant increases in vascular capacity. But again, that's good for a mechanism, but whether someone's going to sit in a spa bath for an hour and a half a day. So when we put all this together, this is how I conceptualize. So this is it works for me. So regardless of how we do our stress, so it may be thermal, it may be hypoxic, it may be novel. Regardless, it's conferring some form of strain. And it's important to consider the intensity, the duration, the frequency, and the pattern of any stressor that we impose. And the strain profile that we get initially may drive a fatigue and will certainly then drive an adaptation. And from a physiology perspective, can't even say the word, Mike, that for me is, that's what we're adapting. We're either adapting our resting status in terms of we're changing isoforms, we're increasing heat shock proteins, increasing massive substrates, muscle, hemoglobin. And I think one we often overlook is experience and our neural connectivities. But the experience in particular is something that won't necessarily be gained from doing cross-adaptation. So it's only through doing the real thing that we necessarily get that, and sometimes we may be setting somebody up for some unintended outcome if we think we've primed the physical system and we haven't primed their ability to be in that environment, their awareness of the implications of it. But often we see when we condition people, it's their stress response characteristics that are much more impressive than the resting individual. And there we can summarize that just through the effect of sensitivities, power, capacity, efficiencies. Again, their experience being in that stressed situation, including their mental resilience. And again, that's something we overlook. And if we're looking at the utility of exercise and environmental stresses in society, that's something I think we do really need to pull into the equation. And how much adaptation you get and what these things do to you acutely depends on who you are. And that's affected by all sorts of things. So that for me is how I pull it all together, and I try and then rationalise, okay, does it matter if I increase this by half an hour a day or if I add this one to this one, and then I might do some vibration plate training or so forth. And if I summarise, down, there's what I think the basic novel stresses are, and they're the characteristics or the parameters of an environment. Now, back to that question. What's the most important environment for humanity? And I think, in any question, I always tell the students, for example, you don't have to answer a question at face value. Ask me what I mean to make sure you've got it right, that you're answering the right question. So if I clarify that question, do I mean the one that we kill is it the one that kills? Is it the one that kills the quickest or the most? So if we go and look at Mike's information from earlier in the week, maybe it's a lack of oxygen. Now, I don't happen to know. I assume space would kill the fastest unless you drowned in a certain situation. But space, it wouldn't actually be necessarily lack of oxygen. I don't know whether you'd freeze, sublimate, or die of hypoxia first. Does anyone know? Whatever, you're going to be dead pretty quick. But from this one, who kills the most, that's population attributable risk. And that, I think, is lacking physiological defences against a given environment. And there's two aspects there, and Mike dealt with both of them this morning. And one was, if it changes too slowly, it's indetectable. And the other one is you don't have the detectors, the sensors, transducers to detect it in the first place. And all of these environments, perfectly fine. We have the capabilities to detect them, enjoy them, gain experience from them, and adapt to them. But, I think, we're all scientists, we're all skeptics. I think I can smell a rat from a while away. But I think I'm baldric when I'm put in this company. And the problem is the insidious nature of it. I don't even really like drinking that much. But a good sake is lethal. It tastes fantastic and it creeps up on you and it's too late. And I think that's what our environment does. Our modern environment just removed all stresses, all useful stresses that we transiently get exposed to that increase our capability and the quality and the extent of life. And we're replaced by ones that we have no defense against and that slowly degrade our physical capabilities and our functions, and therefore they define our experienced existence. And then we get an internally extreme environment. And at the same time, we complicitly potentiate the environmental stresses around us while we're becoming less intrinsically able to tolerate them. And a classic example of that is if you, for example, were trying to fight a fire, it's our ability to get away from the fire, to tolerate the fire, and also to fight the fire. And then that brings us to this, the ultimate stressor, I think, and it's exercise. And it's exercise because it is the only stressor I know of that will do all of those. And therefore, fitness will do all of this. No other environment will do that. And it will do it powerfully, it's self-regulated, it's safe, unlike, for example, the acceptable doses of these and how you regulate them and what pattern do you get. We don't even know a lot of that stuff. We don't actually know it for exercise very much either, but still. And another thing about exercise is that many stresses, they may impact directly on a tissue. For example, not many impact the brain in that such a good way as what exercise does, but nevertheless, it might be on the heart or muscle or blood vessels or whatever. So they have direct effect on the tissue you're trying to protect. It has systemic effects, for example, in glucose and blood pressure regulation that then that help protect the tissues that are most important. And then this is the kicker, the myokines. I don't know how these other stresses actually have the same effect that a myokine, an intrinsically generated multifactorial stressor, goes out and improves the function of several other organs. So I think exercise really is unique. And fitness, therefore, is your homeostatic power and capacity. If you put those two things together, the rate at which you can sustain homeostasis and your capacity, the volume, the amount of capacity to sustain homeostasis, that is fitness. And fitness will confer multifactorial resistance against many of these environments. And therefore, I think we shouldn't, all I'm trying to say, is just give a physiological rationale as to why we should not forget exercise when we think about, stressful adaptive environments. How are we going? 5 minutes? Thanks. And here's an example. I mean, you could take any homeostatically regulated variable. Let's take fluid. But we look at CO2. I know some people like the CO2, some people like oxygen, some people like blood pressure regulation. Let's take glucose regulation. Let's take temperature. Exercise, a fit person has better capability to both the power and the capacity with which they can sustain the homeostatic variable. And it's no different. For example, the effects of, if we dehydrate and then look at the effect of that on us, and a homeostatically regulated variable will therefore affect our temperature, our metabolism, our cardiovascular system. So if we dehydrate untrained people and then look at how fast their heart rate drifts up during exercise when they're euhydrated compared with the same exercise when they're hypohydrated, and get a fit person euhydrated and hypohydrated, not only do the fit people have less cardiovascular drift in exercise at the same relative intensity, even though they're exercising harder, they are less affected by the dehydration. And that goes across those systems. And it's simply an example of how fitness confers homeostatic capability to then help you withstand these other externally extreme environments. Now, so that's the concept. So who does it work for? I personally don't think it's something for elite athletes. You're taking something away. I mean, you're giving them another stressor, but you're simply substituting one thing for another. And I know I'm published on two sides of the fence here. And the J Physiology, we're supporting this. Just felt I need to clarify this. Against Lars Nebo and Carsten Lundby. And on this, I'm actually with one of the authors on this one, and we're actually saying, there's not much evidence for supporting this, using combined multiple stresses in athletes. The reality was, we were trying to be pretty lukewarm about this. We were just supporting an argument, but we were trying to say, okay, it depends on this and that, and eventually the reviewers said, take a side of the fence. You can't have it both ways. And that's fair enough, because it's a crosstalk. But yeah, I don't think the evidence is really there. It's not to say it's not, again, evidence of absence and absence of evidence, but I don't think we have enough to say that it is much. Ollie might disagree, and that's cool. But I think they are the main issues. And for example, okay, these were untrained people, but we got untrained people to resistance train with one leg hot and one leg not. And if we look at the increase, for example, in the muscle mass in the control leg or the hot leg, it actually increased quite a bit compared, and this is a difference. And if we looked at the 3 repetition maxes, decent increases in 3 rep maxes, control leg, hot leg, and then there's the difference. So they have a big effect, and if there is anything there, it's the icing on the cake, I think, is the key point. But admittedly, they're untrained people. So to then put this little bit more in context, we've got 2 minutes maybe. We're talking about, for example, I know there is talk and people look at the effect of cold on the ability to brown white tissue or beiging the white tissue, white adipose tissue. But, I mean, if you make people who you want to beige their tissue and make it metabolically active, because you're trying to address an obesity epidemic, but remember we also have a hypertension epidemic, and they're actually related. While trying to counter your obesity effects, you're exposing people to chronic cold, and we know that kills people. we know the mortality associated with increased cold exposure goes up. But exercise would actually help prevent, treat, and counteract their effects of them both, even if it didn't help do much to them. So again, we've got to keep our extreme environments and any clinical benefit in perspective. It's not to say I shouldn't do it, and therefore I just wanted to put this slide, and I may even finish here actually, because I've only got a whole lot of our data after that, and that's not particularly interesting necessarily. But this is a point that was made yesterday, and this is why I wanted to get to this point. And that's that, exercise as medicine really annoys me from a few perspectives, one of which their founding sponsor was Coca-Cola. But the other reason is exercise is far more than medicine, and I think it belittles it to say exercise is medicine. But exercise in the environment, that brings a whole, that's empathy for the environment. It's a whole lot of different things. That's much bigger. And it's not only much bigger in terms of the implications of the experienced life and people's ability to engage and be in the environment, but actually for people who can't exercise, we've now captured everybody. Tetraplegics, everybody. Post-surgery, pre-surgery, absolutely everybody with the environment and exercise together. And therefore, that question that was discussed at lunchtime yesterday, for me, exercise curriculum, I think we need to be making sure we've got our first principles given, and we have to have exercise, and we have to have the environment in our exercise prescription, in our exercise curricula. So with that, I'm going to skip through the data. And I was just going to implore, actually, one little thing just to mention. We've actually been looking at trying to, what about those environments? How does it matter how we apply them? And there's actually only 3 studies I know of where exercise has been directly compared against heat, which is remarkable. So we just compared exercise against heat for the cardiovascular and some of the other effects. And we tried different forms of heat because you'd anticipate they might act on the cardiovascular system in different ways, and it turned out not to really be the case. So we actually support Convertino's data from 4 people who were given exercise and 4 people who were given passive heat stress back in 1980, and support the fact that maybe exercise has the bigger effect there. And Tom Bailey's data certainly wouldn't disagree with that. And that we can predict that from very early on. If we just look at the outcome from one exposure, can that predict the chronic exposure? And we think maybe so. Cool. Thank you very much.